Hey everyone, we're gonna get started now. Cool. Welcome. Thank you all for coming. Woo! Yeah. Great turnout today. Thank you so much, everyone. So Stanford Effective Altruism is very excited to be hosting a fireside chat, or more accurately, maybe a waterside chat with Sam Bankman-Fried, the CEO of Alameda Research and the cryptocurrency exchange FTX, the world's richest person under 30, and a longtime member of the effective altruism community. So effective altruism is both a philosophy and global community based on asking the question, how can we do the most good for the world with our limited time and resources? Thinking really hard and using careful reasoning and evidence when possible to figure out the best answer to that question. And then perhaps most importantly, acting accordingly and actually doing it, which is something I think Sam exemplifies very well. So today, we're really excited for Sam to share his perspective on what the world's most pressing problems are, how he's leveraged his skills to most effectively contribute to tackling the world's most pressing problems, and how students and audience members like you can also do the same. I think that Sam's career trajectory demonstrates very well that there are many different ways of doing good and tackling the world's most pressing problems, aside from the standard options that one might think of. And I hope to encourage everyone here to leave this talk inspired to think more creatively about what the world's most pressing problems are, brainstorm all the possible ways that we can tackle them, and then pick the most effective ways to do so ourselves, leveraging our unique skills, motivations, and doing so as part of the broader global effective altruism community. So to start off, Sam, could you share how you first got interested in effective altruism and how it led to what you're currently doing?
Yeah, totally. And thanks for having me. Can you guys hear me in the back, by the way? Is this better? Not better? How about this? All right.
Oh, it's nice.
I can shout, but I think it's better with the mic, right?
Yeah, I think we need the mic for the view.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'll do what I can. Does this work? Can people hear me now?
If people also want to like stand up
Yep.
here, that's also fine. Sorry about the audio situation. Yeah.
So I guess, you know, I sort of thought of myself as a utilitarian for a while, since I was, I don't know, 12 or so, but hadn't actually done anything to operationalize that. And I, you know, didn't really know what to do about that. And I think more importantly, kind of ignored whether there was anything to do about it, and just like preferred not to think about it because it seemed hard. And I think that was true till college. I got to college, and freshman year, I was sort of confronted for the first time with the fact that like there definitely were things that I could do that had some impact on the world, that there are things all of us could do. I think sort of the first thing that hit me was just thinking about farm animal welfare as just like a super clear example of you know, a case where there was just this enormous need in the world to change what was going on, and you know, on a pretty massive scale, and something that was like definitely actionable, and like there are definitely things that we could do to address that problem, given that like, you know, we were also the ones causing it. So that sort of was the first thing that convinced me that like there's at least something that I could do that mattered. And I don't know, spent a year or so kind of Googling around, discovering various proto-EA blogs. I eventually got sort of introduced to a number of sort of members of the EA community. Will McCaskill and Ben Todd and others visited Cambridge and talked with them. And you know, that's sort of the first time that I actually got, you know, introduced to and became part of like effective altruism as like a community and a movement, and a sort of, body of knowledge as opposed to just sort of like an abstract idea.
And yeah, could you elaborate more on how effective altruist principles and getting involved with the community led you to, what you're currently doing right now?
Yeah, so I think sort of the first thing was I was thinking about working for some animal welfare organizations, and sort of they said, look, Sam, like, we honestly, given your background, would probably prefer your money to your time. Not that I'm not the world's most effective leaf litter, but I'm pretty bad at it. And they basically, I mean, it's sort of like the math was really clear once someone said it, like, it seemed pretty clear it's going to be able to like have more impact, on them donating than actually working for them. And then sort of when I got more involved in the EA community, I talked to Will and others. We talked about a few different things I could do with my career, and I don't think it was obvious what I should do, and I wasn't sure. But at the very least, earning to give seemed like a pretty plausible option. And I was a physics major at MIT. It seemed like pretty decent chance that I would be able to have a well-paying job on Wall Street. And so ended up interning at Jane Street Capital, it's a quant trading firm, after my junior year of college. Really liked it there, and went back when I graduated full time, with the plan to make what I could and give it away to EA causes. And I was there for about 3.5 years, and then at that point, thought again sort of about what I should do with my life for the first time in 3 years, and forced myself just to write down like a list of 10 things I could do. And basically, as soon as I wrote down that list, it was kind of clear like where the logic was going to lead, which is that like I didn't know what the best thing was, but a lot of them seemed pretty exciting. And the only way to figure out what the best thing was going to be to try. And so I left Jane Street late 2017, flew to the Bay Area and started exploring some things.
Yeah, so I'd be curious to hear your thoughts. You mentioned farmed animal welfare. How has your thinking on what the world's most pressing problems are, how has that evolved over time, and what are your current best guesses?
Yeah, it's evolved a fair bit. And I mean, the first answer is I don't know what the best thing is. And I think I like am fairly skeptical of people in groups that claim supreme confidence on it. I think they often get into a trap where you discover an argument for why cause X beats cause Y or something like that. But a very similar argument might imply that cause Z beats cause X. And the groups will sort of like conveniently forget to explore that argument. And that actually, if you kind of, the more you drill into it, the less clear it becomes. But that obviously also doesn't mean that there's nothing you can do and it's all hopeless or anything like that. So, my current thoughts are that, first of all, I'm totally convinced that like in expected value, the future is what matters. That like in expected value terms, like the vast majority of all people who will ever live have not yet been born. That doesn't mean that with 100% confidence that is true, but that in expected value terms, it is. At the very least, it's easy to imagine tens of trillions of people eventually living. And, in terms of like sentient beings, in the universe or multiverse or whatever the fuck we're living in, like you could imagine many more zeros being added onto that. And the odds of those events are not so small as to render them inconsequential. So yeah, I think like totally convinced that the long term is what matters. In terms of what we can do now that has real impact on sort of like the long-term trajectory of the world, it's hard. It's hard to find things like it's hard to predictably trace through, cause and effect from what we do today to like the world a century from now. And I do think that we might discover a lot of things that are extremely important and effective to do that no one is thinking of today. Like I think I place like pretty high weight on that, probably substantially higher than a lot of other EAs do. But But in terms of sort of the things that I've seen so far that seem potentially very in fact impactful, you know, I think maybe I'll list like 3 things that like I'm fairly convinced in expected value terms have at least extremely large impact on the future. Which again doesn't mean that they with 100% will, impact the future. Just that if they do, it'll be huge, and that they might. So one of them is emerging biological processes, biotech basically, and this actually branches in a few different directions. There's like a number of ways at once in which like we as a world are starting to discover things to do with biotech that might really change the world. And one of these, which I guess we've seen over the last few years, is we are completely fucking unprepared for a pandemic as a world. Like, I think that's like the clearest takeaway from COVID is that we have no idea what we're doing, and the world is not ready, and like no governments are ready. It's just been a mess, and COVID has managed to wipe out a few years of economic productivity from the world and cause a lot of unhappiness and suffering and death and pain. But the thing to keep in mind is like, as far as like pandemics go, COVID is not the most lethal that it could have been. We got kind of lucky that COVID wasn't like substantially more lethal than it was. And there's real reasons to think that this might be a process which is accelerating rather than decelerating. We are, for better or for worse, as a society, starting to develop biological tools to design a lot of different things, many of which are really fantastic medicines, and some of which are pandemics, and that's terrifying. And so one thing is like, what can we do today to prevent the risk of bio threats in the future? I think this is a real risk, and I think it's shovel ready, which is a sort of unique thing about it. Like, there are things we can do today to get more prepared for future pandemics, especially for pandemics that might have like substantially more destabilizing effects on the world. And I think there are a lot of things you can do, but just like name a few, like rapid detection of new pathogens. Like, it took the world 3 months to figure out what was going on with COVID. That's not great. And that would be way worse if it spread way quicker or was more deadly. And another would be like the ability to rapidly produce vaccine stockpiles. Like, it took us a year after COVID hit to really start getting vaccines out. That was not great, and that is avoidable. But there are a ton of other things you could do as well. So that's sort of like one area that I think clearly could have a huge impact on not just the next year, but the next century or more of the world in extreme cases. A second area is AI. I sort of think of AI as like where bio was like 20 years ago or something like that. Like, it's not, there's sort of like cutting edge AI systems right now are mostly not changing the world. Mostly like chatbots are getting kind of okay. It's like where AI is. And like, GPT-3 is super cool and also not going to destroy the world. But these things grow exponentially. And, if AI keeps getting more powerful, which I think there's like reason to think it very well might and probably will, especially if it does so exponentially, you project out 5, 10, 50, 100 years, you may have some super powerful systems. And I have like really large uncertainty over what that would mean. And it could be absolutely great for the world. Like, it could just solve a lot of problems. It could also create a lot of problems or anything in between. But like our capacity to design something powerful enough to get out of our control is like plausibly going to come over the next decades. And I don't think it's obvious what you do about that today. I think like with pandemic preparedness, it's a lot more straightforward. But I think there are probably some things you can do on, AI direction, safety, risk, and potential today. And I think that those will probably grow over the next decades. And that deserves a lot of sort of thought and preparation. And then the third thing is just politics and policy. It's sort of a weird thing because it's like almost the anti-EA thing. Like, what's sort of like the most boring, like least critical thinking thing you can say for like, you want to change the world. Like, I want to go into politics. But I kind of think maybe it's also just true in addition, like both sort of true if you do no thinking, but also if you do a lot of thinking, it also seems kind of compelling. I spent a lot of time just sort of like doing back of the envelope calculations on like how much impact do policymakers have on the world. I think it's very large. I think like you can see changes, like macro changes in the world and its development and the course that we're going in from at least like the US presidency and at least a few other offices. And I think our ability to help institutions in the political arena, whether it's through the policy side, the electoral side, the politics side, the advisory side, is actually pretty substantial. Spent a lot of time, as have some people doing way more than I am on this over the last few years, doing a deep dive into this. And I think that's sort of the takeaway is that like, yeah, there are pretty powerful things to do there. So I think those are sort of like 3 areas that I've been looking at the most recently.
Yeah, could you maybe speak about a bit more about your thought process on prioritizing the greatest risks to the future of humanity over I guess issues which cause a lot more straightforwardly avoidable suffering, including farm animal welfare or extreme global poverty. Yeah, what made you decide to prioritize this? And when do you think it makes sense for people to prioritize, say, improving the future compared to these more near-term issues?
Yeah, so I guess I want to start by just giving my biggest reservation about it, which is not a theoretical reservation, but it's like, I've seen a lot of people sort of like go through that logic, decide to prioritize sort of like, long-termism, and then do things that are completely ineffective and don't do anything because they like choose some area that seems very important, but they have no idea how to impact and never figure out a way to impact it. And so like one caveat to give is like, I do think it's very important to like, try hard to find, I mean, this sounds stupid to say, but like, try hard to find things that work and matter and, have impact. And that just because you're working on a very effective or very important long-term issue doesn't mean that it will have lots of positive impact. It's very easy to spin your wheels working on an important problem. But with that caveat, sort of, that caveat aside, like, I think the math here is basically just like how many people, how many people are alive today, 7 billion, 8 billion, whatever. How many animals, I don't know, you might get another order of magnitude or a few, depending on exactly where you draw the line, what you think of insects. How many beings could exist sort of, between now and, I don't know, forever or whatever, I don't know, heat death. There's a lot of zeros there. Like you put a lot of zeros at the end of these numbers. And you sort of go through the math of like, what if the world lasted for another million years, right? What if, blah, 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 space colonization, blah, 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 like maybe it gets bigger. Like, and that's even without sort of diving into like, things around like, could there be like new types of sentient beings? Like, yeah, I don't know, maybe. That might even, make numbers bigger. So I think the math is just overwhelmingly in favor of doing things which affect the long run future. But it's worth noting that things that affect today might also affect the long run future as well. I think like politics is one good example of that, or pandemic preparedness, where like, I think those are both things that will have impact both on today and on the long run future. And so I don't think this means like ignore anything that matters today as like, like be scared of anything that impacts today. And in fact, I think things that impact today are often like pretty good predictors of what might have long-term impact. But that the thing that matters in the most is like, is this going to be persistent impact? Is what we do today going to persist into the future in a really important way? And then in the end, do the math. Like, obviously, no one knows what's going to happen, but like, do expected value calculations, ballpark numbers, get order of magnitude or order of magnitude estimates, and do the best you can.
Yeah, so quick plug based on that response. If you'd like to learn more about what many researchers think are the greatest risks to the future of humanity or might permanently curtail our future potential, we've put copies of The Precipice, which is a book by Oxford moral philosophy professor Toby Ord, on most of your seats. Some of you may have also gotten books called Human Compatible, which is about transformative risks from transformative artificial intelligence. If you'd like either Human Compatible or The Precipice or other books related to this topic, feel free to come find us afterwards or sign up to our mailing list, and yeah, we'll send you more books. But yeah, with that, I'll get back to the questions. Yeah, so what do you think is the biggest mistake you've made so far in your attempt to do the most good? And in a similar vein, what are common mistakes you think people in our audience who are trying to, maximize their impact might make?
Yeah, I think I'll like divide that up into two types of mistakes. One type of mistake is like just executing poorly. And I think it really matters. Like the difference between doing a really good job and a kind of okay job is enormous. It's also a little bit boring to talk about almost because like, yeah, I don't know, do good things, don't do bad things, try hard, whatever. But I, but I think it is worth noting, like, when when I first got into crypto in late 2017, started building a trading firm, and goals, earning to give, and it like almost fell apart after 4 months or so, even though I think it was an enormous opportunity. And there's just like a lot of mistakes I made that led into that. I did not know how to fucking run a company. I thought I did, which is maybe part of the problem. And I think the real answer is I knew quite well how to run a company when everything was going very well. When like everyone was happy and on the same page and things were working great. I didn't know what to do when things started going less well. I had no idea. And I sort of floundered, and things sort of stewed and simmered and got worse. And it took me a while to learn that. I think some of those things are things that you just have to fuck up once before you can do right. And I think that some of those things are also things which like you can sort of get advice about. Although I will flag that I got a lot of very bad advice on that as well. So, I don't know, your mileage may vary on that. But putting aside sort of operational mistakes, I think the biggest meta mistake that I made was not thinking early enough and the whole time about maximizing. And it's a little weird because in some sense, that's all I was thinking about, of like, maximizing utility, maximizing my impact on the world. But in a more sort of like down to earth sense, like for a while, my decision-making process was not very maximizing centric. It was more like, oh, there's a good opportunity, let me do it. Instead of like, let me sit and think from first principles about like what the best opportunity is, or like consider 50 opportunities and like really hold myself to a very high standard of like being honest to myself about the expected values. And I sort of think what the math often implies is that like the highest expected value thing is what the math says the highest expected value thing is, not what you think it is, or what you want to think it is. And that like often it's something which is a little bit unknown or risky. And decisions that I very much regret in retrospect often look like, I did that because it seemed like it was kind of gonna be good, and then didn't think hard for a while about what I should do, and just sort of like, rode the wave, chilled out. And like I thought myself as working hard that whole time. But I think I was also just sort of settling for good, not great. The other thing is like what are sort of like the types of decisions that I like don't regret, that I like very much appreciate. There's multiple times that I have gotten on a plane with a backpack to fly somewhere and then never gone back, or not gone back for like a year or more. And I think those actually usually turned out to be like good decisions. And I think like it's a little bit weird, but I think it was right. And that like more generally, like decisions that might seem extreme are often also, or rather are usually very bad, but decisions that are the best decisions also often seem extreme. And if you become convinced sort of intellectually that something is the right thing to do, and also instinctually it seems like it could be really high upside, but it just seems weird, drill into why it seems weird. And if it seems weird because it's like has really bad negative knock-on effects, like, yeah, that can be a big problem. But if it just seems weird because it's like extreme and not what people do, I don't know, maybe that's the reason that there's an opportunity, because no one else does things that people don't normally do,
Yeah, so kind of on that point about being extreme, I think one thing a few people asked about was your work ethic and the number of hours you work a week. So yeah, I'm curious if you think extreme conscientiousness or working almost incessantly or obsessing over a problem, how important to quality do you think that is? And is this a character trait that you cultivated? Was it something you think you were born with or has been around for a while? Yeah, and what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, so I guess I'll start by saying, like, I don't know, I've seen people who work too hard and people who work not hard enough. And like I think you can err in either direction. Um, and I think that like the boring, uninteresting answer to this is like work the right amount. And I don't know, what does that mean? It means like don't work if you're working so hard that you're not sleeping and you're dysfunctional and like you're falling apart and you're like extremely unhappy. Um, but on the other hand, if you like do have a lot more capacity to work more and you think that your work is is the important thing that you're doing, then do it. I want to flag actually something about what I just said, which is like, don't take this as a sign that you should be spending like 20 hours a day on homework in college necessarily, right? Like it's not that working hard is the virtue in and of itself. Like I spent very little time on classwork in college, like embarrassingly little, and certainly my grades reflected that in some cases. And in retrospect, I think that was correct. Kind of like, I don't know, that's not what mattered, not what I wanted to do, and that's okay. Um, but when you've identified the thing that you're doing that has all the impact, yeah, working harder can be valuable. And to give maybe a less bland answer to it, I think there's sort of this meme that travels often that, especially I think you see like quotes from famous people or like, I don't know, life coaches or like, probably this is one of the ingredients for chicken soup for the teenage or whatever those like guidebooks are, which is like a lot of sort of like stuff that sounds like work-life balance. And that sounds like, make sure not to work too hard, make sure to take time off, combined with statements like all your productivity is in your first 25 hours a week. You get nothing done in the next 15. Like it's actually net negative. It's just burning you out. And it's just like detracting from your quality of work. I think it's all horseshit. I think it's just like extremely wrong and like dangerously so. And like, I'm pretty confused why people keep saying this. The straightforward answer is just the correct one. Like if you work more, you get more done. And like more generally, I think it's more super linear than sublinear. Like my 70th hour is way more valuable than my first hour of work each week because you have to spend like 20 hours just getting context on what the hell you're doing. Like your first 20 hours, you don't get anything done. You're just like reading all the Slack messages you've missed, right? And like your next 10 hours are spent like getting context from people outside, like whatever. There's a ton of ramp up time and like continuous ramping up time and continuation time to keep on top of what you're even doing with your life and what's even going on in work. And like only once you have all that context can you work as efficiently. And so like my real answer to this question is like identify how much you actually can work. And like just to throw some numbers out there, like there are 24 hours in a day. If you're working 22 hours per day, it is extremely likely that you're working too hard. It's extremely likely that you're going to be very sleep deprived and ineffective because 2 hours of sleep is not enough. Like you will probably die. Do not do that. But, and that's like absolutely true and it's important. And there are people who like, blow themselves out because they just like don't sleep or don't sleep as much as they should. But let's say that you slept 8 hours a day. I don't know what the right number is. Let's go with that for now. And then you had like 2 hours a day of like other stuff, like getting ready for things. That gets you to 10. There's 14 hours left per day. 14 times 7 is, what's that, 90, 98? 98 hours per week is a lot of hours. That's way more hours than anyone will ever tell you you should work, than anyone will ever tell you it's healthy to work. And it is completely compatible with getting plenty of sleep and also having time to like eat and shower and things like that. Like, I think it's just like a weird thing that people like never do this math. That like it is actually compatible to like keep yourself healthy and also work a lot. Now, obviously there are sacrifices there, right? Like I did not put 4 hours a day of League of Legends in there. And I also didn't put 4 hours a day of socializing in there. And like, I'm not saying 98 is the right number. In fact, that's more than almost anyone works, right? But like, there's a long way to go between that and like 40. And so I think if you really are trying to maximize how much good you can do for the world, like what's important is like, think carefully about this and like figure out what the right number is for you. And like, the right number is probably bigger than what most people will say. It's probably bigger than what most people think is normal or reasonable or healthy, but it's not unhealthy. Like there's just like more hours in the week than people usually acknowledge. And like, figure out which of the numbers between like 25 and 98 is like the right number for you. I guess I will say that like, I think the average, person that I work with probably works like 60 hours a week or something like that. I don't know, like 10 hours a day, 6 days a week is like about average. We don't enforce that. Like we don't have like, time cards or anything like that, or, limited vacation days or anything. I think it's just a product of like being driven to do what you're doing. But yeah, I think the basic answer is like, there's a limit to how hard you should work, but that limit's actually pretty high.
Thank you. Yeah, for our crypto audience, yeah, could you maybe share your thoughts on the future of crypto regulation and yeah, what you think about cases like SEC versus Ripple and yeah.
Totally. So this is like by far the most important thing to the crypto industry right now is like, what is the future of regulation? And no one knows for sure. And there's sort of like two arenas that this is playing out in. One is the United States, the other is sort of like the rest of the world. In general, there are like 200 countries in the world. There's a lot. There do not exist 200 governments who have thought carefully about cryptocurrency regulation. So let's just start there. Like most countries in the world have not yet thought hard about what their regulatory framework for crypto is. They are starting to, like there's going to be a lot of development of that over the next few years. But it's a mess and it's all over the place. And like each country's just in a different place, right? And like each regulatory body's in a different place. Each jurisdiction's in a different place. Some of them have built out comprehensive frameworks, very few, like 2 of them have. Some of them have like limited sandboxes, and some of them have no clue. Some of them have vestigial systems which maybe apply to crypto, it's unclear. Some of them are giving lots of guidance, some of them are not. There's just a huge range. And like the most important thing is that like as this develops, regulators globally are giving cues about how they're thinking. You'll see announcements come out, you'll see bills come out, you'll just see like tweets from regulators, you'll see actions coming out, you'll talk to them, and you patch that, together as best you can to understand what does each jurisdiction want, and what can we do to be as compliant with that. And in some cases that's like, here's a detailed bill, let's read that. Another, it's like, this regulator recently complained about this on CNN. Like, probably we should look into that and like make sure not to do that. When you look at the United States, I think that there's a lot of people talking past each other on crypto regulation. I think that you'll often see sort of, industry saying, complaining that they're not getting enough guidance from regulators, that the rules are not well defined, and complaining about enforcement actions coming before guidance is given. On the other hand, I think you'll see sort of regulators push back and say, hey guys, sure, but like what some of you are doing is just clearly illegal. Like this isn't a question of like lack of clarity. Like some things there is clarity on, and you're clearly over that line. It's like, stop distracting with like, other hypothetical stuff, which is not what you're doing, which might be unclear. Like, yes, there will be enforcement actions because what you're doing is clearly wrong, and you should know that. And I think like both of those are true. Like it is both the case that like there needs to be more clarity in crypto regulation in the States, and it's also the case that there is clarity already on some things. And I think somehow like that gets lost, and like people assume that it has to be always one or the other. To give sort of some examples of that, like there exist tokens which are clearly not securities. There exist tokens which are pretty clearly probably securities, and there exist tokens where it is legitimately unclear whether or not they are a security. Like all 3 of those categories exist. So where's this going? I don't know. No one knows for sure. But if I had to guess, I would say the healthy thing, the productive thing, which hopefully is where it's going, is like a discussion between regulators and industry about here's where this needs to end up. Here's the things that we need to ensure that it's a safe field. And here are the things that would be helpful for industry to make it able to thrive. And what are paradigms that could be created that are sort of consistent with how regulators think about these things, that could allow for both of those. And like to throw one example out there on stable coins, I think there's been a lot of discussion about how to regulate stable coins. I don't know what the right answer is, but I think like a pretty reasonable place to start would be to have like a registration and transparency based regime, which centers around like stable coins, making it absolutely explicit what their holdings are and making that public, having periodic audits on that, having rules governing what type of debt-like assets they can have on their balance sheet, and having some rules and guidelines around what is acceptable, and that would like address a lot of the concerns that I think you hear today, without stifling the industry, but like making sure that there's consumer protection. And I think there's a lot of other things you throw at that as well. And I think on the digital asset token side, I would be really excited to see a paradigm built out for things that might or might not be securities, that sort of combines together the market oversight and consumer protection and transparency that the securities regime offers, with the sort of like dynamic growth that you've seen in the cryptocurrency industry, over the last 5 or so years. Who knows if that'll happen, but I'm cautiously optimistic.
Yeah, I guess another question that often comes up, what are your thoughts on emissions generated by proof of work blockchains, given the future of both crypto and climate change? And yeah, how do you see that balance?
Yeah, I think it matters. I think like I'm frustrated with people who try and say this doesn't matter at all. I'm also a little frustrated with people who say this is the biggest problem in the world. I think it's somewhere in between irrelevant and the biggest problem in the world, like almost all problems are. To give some sense of scale, one thing you look at is like emissions generated by by blockchains relative to their economic value or something like that. There's a lot of ways to measure this, but I think you generally get a number which is like probably a little bit worse than the average activity, although not enormously. Maybe it's a factor of 1 to 5 worse. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind, that like it is currently a relatively carbon intensive industry, but not a massively intensive one. What are sort of like, realistic practical steps to take to address that? First of all, this is really specific to proof of work as opposed to proof of stake blockchains. To the extent that you can have many transfers happening through proof of stake systems, that helps a lot in reducing the footprint. Whether this is new blockchains, whether it's layer 2s, Lightning, side chains, whatever it is, that saves like very close to 100% of the emissions, right? Because where this is coming from is the fact that like is literally energy usage, which determines mining on proof of work blockchains. So I think that's sort of like one way to approach this. It's worth noting that like, as Ethereum transitions to ETH2, that is going to decrease the fraction of the crypto network, which is on proof of work blockchains, and probably put actually a pretty massive dent into the emissions of the industry, as one of the most used blockchains. And then the last thing is doing what we can to sort of offset and help development around green tech. And so we're buying carbon offsets equal to all the emissions from transfers in and out of FTX each year. Those are, I think, good things to do. It's not super scalable, and it doesn't solve the long-term problem. It's not scalable because eventually you run out of people to tell not to pollute, and you have to actually stop some of the like pollution that is happening, and or like remove carbon. And so on top of that, we're also funding a bunch of projects related to carbon capture, actually removing pollutants from the atmosphere. And then the last thing to say here is, if you could have renewable energy source based energy consumption going into proof of work mining, that would also knock out the majority of the carbon footprint of the industry. And so I think it's sort of a combination of those things. And I'm like pretty optimistic that in the next 10 years or so, this is just going to be like a mostly solved thing in crypto, or at least like way, way, way better than it is today. But I do think that's only going to happen if, like, as an industry, we actually make it happen. And I think it's very, very important that we do.
So shifting gears again, Sam said he was open to some difficult questions. So in that spirit, you're probably the prime example of earning to give in the effective altruist community. So earning as much as possible or a bunch of money and then donating it all away to effective causes. But many people are skeptical of this approach to doing good. Some people think the existence of billionaires is a failure of our society. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts. Do you agree? What are your thoughts on the ethics of extreme wealth? And yeah, like the approach of earning to give.
Yeah, I guess I'll give a few shots at that. I First of all, I think that like it's worth acknowledging that there's like a lot of different forms of this. And I just have like very materially different views about like massive inherited wealth, um, you know, massively generated economic activity, and sort of parasitic economic activity. I think in like pretty straightforward ways, those are pretty different. And I think they often get lumped together and probably shouldn't be. I'm like pretty sympathetic to skepticism that that there should be as much inherited wealth as there is. I think it's like a little bit weird that some people are just like born into a gigantic fortune. And you know, I would say that I'm also cognizant of the fact that there are some people who have made a ton of money doing really bad things. Now, there's a lot of versions that not everyone's going to agree on what those are, but you know, maybe it's in the abstract that that's true. But I think then like probably the thing to address is not the fact that it made money, but the fact that it was a thing they could and were incentivized to do. Like it's sort of like the thing that's bad is the thing to address there. I You know, putting those aside, I think that in theory, if you sort of, as I don't, believed that markets were perfectly efficient, they're not, then, you know, any wealth generated would be stemming from value provided to the world. And there's not, I think, much of a moral concern with, you know, extreme wealth accumulation. Now, I don't believe that markets are perfectly efficient, and I don't believe that is always what's happening. But I do think it's sometimes what's happening, maybe often. And I don't personally have a problem with that. The last thing that I'll say is, which I think for me is the most important, for myself at least, which is, you know, I think mostly the positive impact that I'm going to have is what I do with my money. And I think that like, it would be one thing if like the way of generating it was like extremely bad, and I would be like pretty worried about that. But if that's not the case, then I you know, and you're sort of like accumulating it in like an ethical and responsible way, then I think that like the amount of good that you can do with it is absolutely enormous, and ends up being by far like the biggest factor in that equation, and I feel pretty excited about that.
Yeah, so what are some maybe unusual ways of doing good that people probably haven't heard of that you're really excited about, both that, you know, donations could help out with or direct work?
Yeah, totally. I maybe want to start that just by, well, I think maybe there might be a pretty wide variety of like priors in the audience on like how much the EA community is currently bottlenecked by funding versus talent. I think there's been a lot of very, very bad messaging over the years on that. I think there's a lot of messaging that is all a funding bottleneck, and then a pretty sharp turn towards it's all a talent bottleneck. And I think they're both wrong. My sense is that both matter. And I think like, as I've sort of spent more time trying to find things to fund, I found more things to fund, and don't currently feel like strongly under constrained on funding and over constrained on talent. I think both are very much limiting factors. And there are ways to really scale up the amount of good that you can give to. So what are some ways to do it? First of all, I mean, I don't know. I think it's sort of like a little awkward, but it's just true. And probably not worth like, you know, trying to sort of ignore that, like, On the funding side, it's probably going to be very top heavy. It's a property of how the world works today, that like the distribution of how much you can make over various things is not, it's not like a normal distribution. Like the tail is way fatter. And that just has a pretty straightforward implication, I think, which is that like if earning to give is what you're thinking of doing, and to be very clear, I do think that can be incredibly valuable, and I don't think that we are unconstrained on funding. I think you should be thinking big. I think you should be thinking like really no in expected value terms. What's the thing you can do that will make the most? And I want to flag there that if you think that the odds that you will achieve that target through the path are above 30%, you're almost certainly not being ambitious enough. It is almost certainly going to be the case that there is a risk reward trade-off here, that the things that make the most in expected value terms are things that will probably fail. And that if you're playing this correctly, you should be, it's very likely you should be pursuing a path where you think that the median amount that you will end up being able to donate is 0 or very close to it. Like it's sort of brutal and weird, but that's how the math works. Not always, but I think more often than not, that like it's just like super top heavy, and you should be looking for things that have extremely high upside and willing to accept that they might fail, willing to accept that they will probably fail, and to acknowledge that we're trying to maximize our collective total impact in expected value on the world. And, you know, there's no special virtue associated with having at least some impact. Like this stuff is linear. And, you know, expected values, I think, are pretty brutal, but they are what they are. Yeah, if your vision for what you're going to do seems very likely to work, you should think about how to make that vision more ambitious, such, you know, obviously maximizing for how much it will work given that, but like probably you're not being ambitious enough if it seems like it'll probably work. Although it should seem like it could plausibly work, or otherwise probably it's a mistake. On the other side, working directly, well, I guess actually kind of feel similarly, that you should be looking for ambitious things to do that might fail in a lot of cases. What are some things that I think could be like incredibly valuable? I will say that like, take your favorite long-termist area. And there are a lot of discussions about like, how can we ramp up what we're doing there as a community? The biggest bottleneck usually is someone to run the thing. Like, it's not someone to have an idea that we should think about something. Funding is a bottleneck, but it's not the biggest one. It's not people sitting around saying reasonable things. It's not people willing to join on to an like already very effective direct action organization. The biggest bottleneck is who's going to step forward and be like, I'm going to fucking make this happen. And whether that's a biosafety startup, whether it's AI safety, whether that's something in politics, whether that's you know, whatever area you're looking at, like diving in and giving it your all is extremely important. That doesn't mean you have to do that from the beginning, and probably you shouldn't. Probably you should get some context first. I think like I and everyone else would be pretty terrible running something if you don't have any experience in the area and have never tried building something big before. But have that as a goal eventually. Try and dive into areas, try and learn everything you can, soak it all up, and try mini projects, right? Try running a local group. Try, you know, building out some, I don't know, website. Try doing some for-profit company, whatever. Like, get experience building things out. And this doesn't need to be, sorry, this doesn't need to mean that you are the one person running it. And I think that is like not always the most important person. There's often a few other people who are extremely important and are the people who make it work, right? Like being a great operator is extremely valuable, right? And like helping a project out from the beginning and doing all of the work necessary to make it go well is like incredibly valuable. Being a big, like a good team player is incredibly valuable. There are a lot of things that help a lot. But just diving in and doing things like, I don't know, the strongest advice I can give is like, don't go to grad school. almost no one should ever go to grad school. It's a huge fucking mistake. I've basically never met someone who's glad they went. Like, I actually can't emphasize this enough. There's some exceptions. If your path to impact is becoming a machine learning professor at a top university, yeah, you should probably go to grad school, right? Like, I'm not saying there literally doesn't exist a career path for which that's the right thing to do, but actually there exists very few. And like, you know, there's just like, you almost always get more knowledge, more experience, and more value jumping in and trying something than trying to learn about it in academia. It's just like, it's how it is. And that's true in just like almost every field. A lot of the best places I know often just like don't even hire grad students. They're just like, whatever, they made their choice. And it's a little bit brutal, but like, it's sort of like how it is. And so I think like, yeah, feel pretty strongly about things like that, like, you know, you should jump in, you should get your hands dirty, you should try things out. You should try and build something. You should try and join something that's being built. You should try and join a place that's doing well that you can learn a lot from. And you don't have to have it all planned out from the beginning. No one does, and everyone who does is probably choosing the wrong thing. You know, you can learn as you go. Everyone does. Don't worry about that. It's fine to be heat seeking, as long as you're sort of like keeping maximizing in the back of your mind as you go, and you're iterating quickly.
Yeah, I think we have time for one last question. So I think you basically answered this already, but what concrete advice do you have for students for how they should be spending their time, how to be more ambitious, how to better optimize for their goals, figuring out what their goals might be or ought to be? Maybe what would you do differently if you were a student or a first year now at MIT or Stanford? And yeah, any last words that you'd want to leave the audience with before wrapping up?
I go back to 2010, drop out and buy a lot of Bitcoin. But seriously, I think there's something a little bit true there, although that's not exactly what I think I could have predicted. Which is that in 2012, I had a friend at MIT who was sort of bored one day. I think some guy, I don't remember who, gave one free Bitcoin to every MIT student around then. I think there was like, I don't know how it's, what, like $5 at the time or something. And anyway, one of my friends, Gary, got bored and built some Bitcoin arbitrage bots for the sort of nascent crypto exchanges that were around back in the early 2010s. Sort of made some money doing it, not a lot. Sort of saturated the market. There wasn't a lot of volume. But that was pretty cool. Never really checked it out that much. Was kind of tempted to. Got distracted. He stopped doing it because there's like, it wasn't a big enough field to make much. And then neither of us thought about crypto again for 5 years. And I guess then I called him up and we founded Alameda together. I mean, certainly in retrospect, it's hard to argue that like it wouldn't have been correct for us to just drop everything and do that back in 2012. And obviously there's a lot of stupid retrospective thinking there where like we couldn't have known what would happen. But I actually think at the time we should have done it. We shouldn't have been able to predict how well it would have gone. But diving into something that seems exciting and giving it your all and seeing how far it will go, I think it's just like an incredibly good strategy in life. And it's way better than, you know, sort of dicking around for another few years, not doing much, or just sort of like following the status quo. If you see a great opportunity, I sort of think take it, whatever it is. If it seems way better than whatever else you'd be doing by some sort of like weird expected value calculation that seems like it can't possibly be right, but kind of feels cool, I think it is probably right in expectation. And yeah, it'll probably fail. That's okay. Most things do. You can try another thing. And I don't know, that could be in a lot of different ways, right? Like that could be some earning to give startup. That could be jumping in some EA organization. That could be taking charge of running Stanford EA. That could be working, you know, diving into some biorisk research, or some other wacky thing. Like, I don't know, there are a lot of awesome things to do out there. And you know, I don't know, try them, see how it goes. Try things that seem like they'll either be the right thing for you to do for the time being and teach you a lot, or like the upside, if they go extremely well, is extremely high. And like if the thing you're doing is neither of those, I don't know, keep your eyes open for something else.
All right. I think we'll wrap up now. Thank you so much, Sam. Yeah, and thank you to everyone in the audience who showed up today. Yeah, we have some snacks and water. I don't know if that's enough for everyone, but we will see. But yeah, if you'd like to get more involved with the Effective Altruism group, feel free to come catch me or any other Stanford EA member. We'll all be wearing these EA stickers on our shirt. And you can also join our mailing list and chat with us. Yeah, thanks for coming, everyone. Bye.